Hello and welcome to Education Marketer Live. Personalization is hardly a new topic, but there's been a lot of news recently that might suggest that it's time to have a look at what personalization means in 2023 for higher ed institutions. We also have the increasing emphasis on AI technology and how personalized content as a form and our expectations around it has changed as a result of Chat GPT. And we also have like the normal sort of go-to things like TikToks for you feed and how that might have changed expectations over time as well. So, like I said, it's probably time to take a bit of stock and have a look at what personalization means today. Joining me today, I have Toby and Julie from Squiz, both experts in personalization in their own right. Toby's more on the UX side and user experience, and Julie, a returning guest on the product side at Squiz. So, welcome both. Toby, I want to start off with you. Often personalization is kind of misunderstood, not just in higher ed, but further afield as well. When there is a kind of danger that it's oversimplified. So when we say about web personalization, I think a lot of people's sort of default views sometimes goes to like the basics, like updating a homepage banner and sending an alert to someone on a website when they've completed a series of actions. But with a lot of like different technologies coming into the market, that view might have changed. And in your working with higher ed institutions, what do you think the kind of lay of the land is at the moment? Are we looking at personalization the right way? Do you think there's new opportunities? How would you say it's changed over the last couple of years?
When we talk about personalization, often the kind of usual suspects crop up. We talk about TikTok, we talk about Spotify, Amazon, Netflix, who are these kind of masters of personalization.
Mm,
And they're obviously these sort of hugely successful companies. They're massive companies that have enormous budgets to do really great stuff with. And I often kind of think we end up in HE trying to compare ourselves and what we're doing with these organizations, which can be a little bit tricky because we often don't have the same budgets as these organizations, and we don't have the same amount of time and ability to invest that time into personalization. So I often think kind of comparing HE to those can be, as I say, a little bit tricky or a little bit unhelpful. I think also they tend to be kind of based on a model of you like that because you watched it on Netflix, or you listened to it on Spotify, or you bought it on Amazon. Therefore, there's a good chance you will like this movie, which actually is at its kind of core a very kind of simple thing. And that's why I think the success of those kind of companies is a little bit easier to understand versus when we kind of compare that to an HE context. HE is definitely a lot more complex, and the user journeys that we have in HE is a lot more complex. And so I think it's very difficult to kind of compare those two things, and people get a little bit caught up and think, well, it's when I sit down in the evening and I watch a movie on Netflix or I get something recommended to me, that's a really nice experience. Like, why can't we kind of copy that or mirror that in the HE world? And the answer really is that it's a lot more complex in the HE world, and it's not as kind of consumption led. The kind of the view of the movie or the listening of the song or the purchase of something on Amazon, that's very much the end goal. But
mm,
actually with getting a user to interact with a piece of content, although that's great if it's a bit of content we want them to interact with, it's not necessarily the end goal. The end goal tends to be, we want an enrollment or we want an application. And that's a kind of a much slower burn process that involves a lot more kind of touch points throughout the process. What should HEB be aiming for? Simplifying the process is definitely a good thing. Having a system whereby you can segment your users in a very kind of simple and high level way, and then be able to deliver them content that is relevant to that particular segment. That is ultimately what we're aiming for. And I'm sure we'll kind of get into that in a little bit more detail around exactly how we do that. But there are loads of kind of points there, I think, around keeping that simple, not trying to kind of run before you can walk. That's where we see clients, I think, getting tripped up, is where they try and do too much too quickly, not wanting to become a TikTok overnight. That's definitely an aspiration I think HE should have. And yeah, as I say, kind of an appreciation that the world of HE is actually very, very different from the world of, watching a movie or listening to a song on Spotify.
I think you're absolutely right because when you go to these platforms, like whether it's Amazon or Netflix, the use case is quite narrow. So you're a user, you're going shopping, you purchase something, you get recommendations. definitely not that transactional on a university website. And similarly with Netflix, it's you go on, the content's just there. There's
Yeah,
nothing, no kind of input. You just kind of see what's available to you. And
absolutely.
your your point about segments is an important one, because I think like the kind of like similar to the kind of Netflix audience, your kind of viewers are, or your kind of users, your university website are quite segmented. Your audiences are huge, so like nailing that criteria and who you're talking to. When you use personalization, you don't necessarily have to use it as an umbrella sort of thing, do you? You can go, right, well, initially we're going to focus on this part or this area of the website to deliver a more personalized experience, rather than, like you said, going like the full aspirational route and going like 100% straight from the go. Because this is a learning curve, isn't it? It's quite a lot to get your head around.
It really is, yeah. It's a really good point as well. Around HE, you have very kind of distinct audience types as well. You've got loads of people ranging from undergraduates to postgraduates to internal staff to board members, and they all want extremely different things out of an HE experience. Conversely, if you look at kind of Netflix or Spotify, for example, the target audience is like everyone. Everyone listens to music, everyone watches movies, and it doesn't actually really matter too much about the personal preferences. What
Mm.
we've got is just a system where we have a content item, so a movie or a song, that is stuffed full of metadata. And all we're then doing is, if somebody listens to that song or watches that movie, we then just show them other things which have similar types of metadata. And if we do that well, that's job done. That's a win. That's kind of all we want. We don't really have to go beyond that. We don't have to kind of convert somebody. We don't have to keep them warm throughout a process. We don't have to get them in for an open day. We don't have to get them downloading a prospectus. We're not asking them to commit, 3 or 4 years of their life and to spend tens of thousands of pounds doing something. It's a very kind of different world that we're living in. And so, yeah, I do that word transactional, I think you used, Carl, is a really important one there. And so, yeah, for HE, I definitely think breaking it down, as you mentioned, into kind of segments from an audience point of view, but also focusing on very specific parts of the user journey that a user will go through when interacting with an HE institution is vital. Otherwise, it just gets very, very overwhelming very, very quickly.
Yeah, can you imagine if Netflix had to get people to a physical location? How different that model would be. I mean,
Yeah.
they are trying like physical stores and stuff like that to kind of broaden that remit. And even if you look at something like Disney Plus, I think they're working on integrations with their Disney Plus subscription and theme parks. So there is maybe some crossover for them in the future, but it's a vastly different question and ballpark, isn't it? It's
It
like,
is, yeah. I mean, I would love to keep a close eye on that when they get into that perhaps more physical world, and how they deal with personalization then, because as I say, it
mm,
does become a completely different ball game. Not that I don't doubt they'll be able to do it, given the amount of budgets they work with and the time that they commit to things like personalization. So yeah, that could be a very interesting watch this space one.
yeah, I don't think money's going to be an issue for them somehow. Julie, I'm just thinking of ways in here for higher education providers, and we've been talking a lot recently about AI and how this can almost offer this 100% hyper personalized experience. You type into these chatbots, you integrate them with your own sort of institutional data, and you get these really deep sort of conversational abilities that you just couldn't have in the past. We've mentioned this in a previous episode, but I'd like to go a little bit deeper here in the context of personalization. How could a uni utilize some of this, this technology and those personalization efforts? Is it an avenue they should be going down? Is it like a starting point, or is it maybe something that comes a bit later in the journey?
Yeah, so a lot of starting points, you really want to look at those kind of core activities that you're kind of caring about the universities. And there are a couple of these earlier ones that can really skyrocket with successful web personalization. So the common one really is enrollment. So really around how do we attract more students? And then the second one is research. So finding the right research partners, which will, get you additional funding, the reputation, talent development, etc. So these are kind of these really early ones that you can do, and that where AI can really kind of supercharge that web personalization, automating the tailored outreach, recommendations for relevant courses, research materials, articles, events, news. all of the things based on users' profile that's building up over time and their past behavior. So really getting them more engaged. You mentioned chatbots. So that's another really big area that AI can be really impactful. So providing personalized, instant, efficient interactions. And it goes beyond just, asking for help. So it's, application assistance, like really detailed application assistance on the little bit that they're stuck at to help them get across the line. Virtual campus tours is another big one. So, a lot of university students really want to understand, what is my university experience going to look like? So being able to have a chatbot that can talk you through those virtual campus tours, if getting there in person isn't working, or if they're a remote student, looking at, what does your university experience actually look like? So they're kind of the really early steps that we know that AI can really kind of supercharge with. There's a few universities who are kind of exploring in this area as well. So RMIT here in Australia is using a lot of predictive analytics around that student success and offering personalized responses. Cambridge College is doing a lot around the outreach, as well as Bryant University as well. One thing that's really interesting is Open University. So Open University is obviously online only, and it's got a lot of AI around that enrollment side of things. So around identifying relevant courses and related courses, and keeping the students just sort of on that continuous learning journey with the smaller piecemeal piece courses as well. It's pretty interesting what they're doing there.
So with open universities, this is lifelong learning, isn't it? So I
Yes.
imagine, does that engine kick in once the student's completed a program and then they get recommendations for further skills?
Yeah, for further skills, you can see different pathways that you can take. It ties it into careers as well. So, if you're trying to get towards a specific career goal or something, here are you can really personalize the different courses that can really help you achieve what you're looking for. It's interesting.
There's a few other areas I noticed just happened across the other day actually, and I found quite interesting. So, a platform, I think it's quite large in Australia, the Ambassador platform, kind of built around like peer to peer,
Mm.
very common on university websites in your part of the world. They are looking at the idea of an AI powered ambassador, which I just find fascinating, really. So
Mm.
the whole thing's sort of built on a kind of model underneath it, but then it has the training data from like the institution to inform its responses. Now, when you think peer to peer is usually about that really deep human interaction, throwing in those sort of AI nuances, I think it's quite interesting because you can kind of get that really fast response to students. You do it through an interface that they're used to using. There's other
Mhm.
implications around that, like how does a young person respond to an AI version? They expect different things from it. But actually seeing that, you discuss here like learning sort of applications, we're seeing it move over into those deeply personalized experience with like one-to-one student chats. I don't think there's any area that this cannot potentially touch in the future, right?
Yeah, and I think there's wonder under interactions is where it's going to get more value over time. So,
Mm.
you start quite broad, but when you get that one-to-one interaction that can help them with either, there's a friction point in maybe an application progress, or they just want to know the answer to a question to help them get to the next stage in their journey, that immediate one-to-one personalized response is what they're going to get, and really what helps them get over that sort of hump into the next stage of what or where they want to go. I know when I was enrolling in university a few years ago, I was doing my master's, and I had to sit on the phone for 20 minutes to wait, on hold to get the answer to a question around a
Mm.
payment I was having with. And, that wasn't great. But if I could have got the answer instantly personalized with, I understand, here is the financial process you need to go through, that would have been a much better experience. And I wouldn't probably be relating that story now because wouldn't have even hit my memory.
No, that's it, isn't it? Well, I guess the
Yeah.
university gets the notice because you just reiterated it there. But yeah, like why would you even mention it? Because it's just something you view as
It's
transactional.
joy.
It would have just
Yeah.
been done. Um, it's interesting if people are thinking about this and in terms of like incorporating AI into this use, like this customer service approach. One stat that I found really interesting is that we worry about the personal touch, the human touch, and having that high value kind of human driven content always for students. But actually, there was a recent piece of data published by the Keystone Education Group that shows that students value a fast response more than a quality answer, which I know sounds really ridiculous. Like, oh, what the content's low quality? Well, there's actually a balance. So there seems to be this preference for speed over a deep answer. They're happy to wait a little bit for the deep answer if that question can be triaged. So for me, that seems like a bit of a quick win there for using AI related chatbots.
Yeah, and I think that tracks with everything else we know around web behavior, with attention spans are getting smaller, people's patience for slow loading websites is getting less. I
Mm,
think a quote I used to use, I think it was 54% of people used to leave if a website took more than 3 seconds, and now it's
Yeah.
like 80 something. No one's got any patience for anything these days, and sometimes you just need that surface level answer to get you to the next bit. You don't need a detailed, conversation with someone. It's just give me the answer. Everyone's very
yeah.
impatient these days.
Yeah, always be interacting. Toby,
Mm.
I want to pick up on a few more examples from you. You alluded like in your opening to some of the examples we wheel out, like Amazon and TikTok, and these incredible sort of pedestal based examples. I'd like to bring that down into the real a little bit. And I know because you work in UX, you've got some more sort of practical, sort of within reach, like aspirational examples for people. Do you want to take us through what some of those are and what the lessons can be?
Yeah, absolutely. I think actually just before I do that, there's one example I wanted to bring up, which isn't obviously one of ours, which is Amazon. But actually, it's kind of a negative example, and just an
Mm,
example of how, even though we put these kind of organizations on a bit of a pedestal and they do incredible stuff, I'm sure you maybe have heard it before. There was a sort of famous tweet a while ago now related to Amazon. It was very funny. It was a woman who I think had bought a toilet seat from Amazon and then
mm,
proceeded to kind of get an influx of email comms and recommendations about, try this toilet seat, try that toilet seat, as if she was some kind of toilet seat connoisseur. That's a really nice sort of amusing example, though, of how actually you can kind of get this wrong if you don't understand the kind
mm,
of nuances of exactly what you're doing. And the obvious point there is that, people buy a toilet seat and it tends to be a one-off purchase, and you don't buy loads of toilet seats. You just don't. And the ability for their kind of model to understand that, at least when this tweet was written, wasn't quite there, and that then leads to this slightly jarring experience.
mm,
So yeah, even though these kind of companies have buckets of money and spend huge amounts on their algorithms, it is still possible to get it wrong, which does kind of highlight how difficult it is. But yeah, on that kind of front, to talk about a few kind of closer to home examples, I guess it would be remiss of me not to talk about certainly one of our own. One that I really like is UTAS, University of Tasmania. We've built them kind of a little personalization or customization panel, which you can go and check out. It's actually really simple, which is definitely the place to start, but it works really well. And the premise is very simple. When you land on the site, you can open up a little panel, and you can self-select a few options. So you can say, I'm an undergraduate, or I'm a postgraduate, or I'm a research student, or I'm just interested in the university. A few different options in there.
yeah.
You can also self-select whether you're an international student or not. And making those selections then gives you some very kind of subtle elements of personalization throughout the site, where different components will appear within the homepage and deeper into the site that are then more relevant to that particular person. So a good example of that is on the homepage. UTAS have kind of like a student stories section, which is kind of what it sounds like. It's a series of stories where students are talking about their experience of being at the university. Now, obviously, if you are a prospective student coming from China and you're an undergraduate, it's going to be a lot more interesting and relevant to you if you could see other international students who are undergraduates. If they're Chinese, even better. I've got someone that really reflects what I'm trying to do, and I can then that stuff will really resonate with me. If I'm a sort of domestic undergraduate and I'm seeing stories of international postgraduates, that to me is not quite right. That doesn't reflect the experience that I'm
Mm,
hoping at the university. And a one size fits all approach can't really cope with that. You've kind of got to go, oh, look, we've got a plan for every conceivable user type that we might have. So, let's put 4 or 5 different ones from different areas in. And that then becomes a little bit difficult to kind of wade through. So yeah, that's one example of a really nice kind of subtle piece of personalization. And I do think that's where personalization tends to be most effective, when it is quite subtle, when you almost don't really kind of notice it happening in the background. That to me is where it really kind of works well. and also fits in with another point I wanted to make about kind of research and really doing your research before you kind of implement any form of personalization. So in order to do effective personalization, you have to know a lot about your audience types. You have to know what they want. Of course, there are similarities across the kind of world of HE in terms of what students want, but actually there are also subtle differences, and not every kind of student base is the same. Not every university has exactly the same types of audiences. They all want slightly different things. It might be, based on where the university is in the world, loads of different factors that kind of influence exactly what a student is looking for. And I just think that's a really interesting thing, how if you can get a really deep, solid understanding of what it is exactly your users want, you can then use that to do some really insightful things with personalization. These guys worked out that actually, yeah, there's this kind of idea of psychological urgency and fear of missing out that is
Mm.
created amongst the kind of undergraduate audience base. And so they kind of played on that a little bit. But at a really kind of simple level, there are plenty of examples of universities doing personalization where, for example, they've just segmented their user base into, let's say, undergraduate and postgraduate. And they'll realize things like undergraduates are far more likely to want to see imagery related to maybe the campus, or the student union or other facilities like that, because it's, that's at that age, that's the sort of thing they're looking for. Postgraduate may be less interested in those kind of things. And so they want to see perhaps different types of imagery. And that's a really like super, super simple way of doing some personalization, simply changing the imagery based on a very kind of large and high level demographic. But again, it's little wins like that and little subtle wins which add up to kind of be big wins overall, I think.
Yeah, and I think your emphasis here, and I think what we often forget is before we dive into personalization tools, there is that very valuable step before it, isn't it? Like we're essentially working out what the audience wants. So you said there, like you've identified that what that fear, if you want, is the word you use there, that kind of desire. Um, and then you design those experiences around that, and then also how that links into like not more aspirational content or like content marketing programs, but the real sort of basic hygiene kind of content approach. So, what does a UG audience need to see? What does a postgraduate audience need to see? Love the idea of personalization being used to create dynamic content around the use of components. We often view web pages like these static assets, don't we? When we update them and we keep the content fresh, but the ability to actually identify who you are, self-identify, so you're not being intrusive with your data collection or anything like that, and then page actually updates to reflect that content you want to see, whether that's imagery, almost like holding up a mirror to the user to make them feel like they're at home. So they're therefore more likely to feel like they're connected, more likely to make actions. And
Yeah.
the fear of missing out thing is great as well. I love that. Like updating your CTA depending on how many times someone revisits a page. It would
Yeah.
seem like a really basic metric, but I guess if someone keeps coming back to a page, they're clearly in the market for that decision, aren't they?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think they've possibly taken a bit of inspiration there from like the travel sector. You often see it when you're trying to book a
Yeah.
hotel or something like that. You come to a web page to book a hotel, you maybe don't commit right there and then. Then the next time you come back, you'll say, oh, these are flying off the shelf. There's only 2 rooms left. And whether or not they might be slightly playing with the truth is hard to say. But actually, what it does, it creates that sense of scarcity and urgency, which then makes you more likely to want to commit to converting there and then. But yeah, just kind of one final thing, Carl. You mentioned something there which I think is super super important, and it's actually just asking yourself the question. So if I'm a head of marketing at a university and I ask myself the question, what do my undergraduates actually want? If you don't have a good answer to that question, then you're not in a great place to be able to start doing personalization. You need to have a really good, solid understanding of actually what your undergraduates want, what postgraduates want, what research students want, what your PhD students want, all of those different things. If you don't actually know the answer to what do they want, you're going to have a really, really tough time guessing at what kind of content you should be showing them, the appropriate point. And we don't want to be in a position where we're guessing. We want to be in a position where we've got data and insight to be able to kind of back all of that stuff up. So yeah, another really kind of key part, and it's probably something I'm sure we'll touch on a little bit later on, particularly when it comes to AI, is around how that can probably help us make better sense of that data, to then help us do better personalization. I think that's going to be a a key thing.
So let's build on that then, because you kind of gave us a nice sort of avenue into it. What are some of the common challenges that you come up against when working with universities over personalization? So, for instance, when you're consulting, when you're working on UX-based projects, are there any common issues that come up? What ways have you put in place in the past to get around those?
Yeah, so I think we've definitely touched on a couple already, and that is one, not knowing your audience well enough. I think it's not an uncommon occurrence to kind of sit in a room with people who are really excited about the prospect of doing some personalization, but then getting very quickly into the kind of the what and the solution, and kind of going, oh, we could do this, and we've got some really great ideas around what we could do here. But then actually, when you dial it back and go, okay, cool, that's all wonderful and great. But actually, what is it that your undergraduates want, or what is it that this segment you've identified want? Often it kind of falls down a little bit there, and people will sort of and ah about it and go, oh, well, we think we think they want this, and we think they want. It's like, well, actually, how do you know that? Have you tested that? Have you sat down with your audience and asked them? Have you run focus groups? Have you run, questionnaires, surveys? There are myriad things you could be doing from a kind of user research point of view, to make sure that you've got that stuff nailed down. And often people kind of skip that step a little bit because they want to understandably get into the more kind of fun doing part, and actually coming up with
Yeah.
mechanics that allow us to serve content to those types in a really neat way. And that, I guess, kind of feeds into another thing, which is going too complex too quickly. We mentioned it right at the front. Universities tend to have lots of different audiences, and you can kind of get very, very granular. You could get as granular as saying, oh, undergraduates that are interested in playing hockey and like this type of subject, that's one audience type. Undergraduates that want to join the chess club that are interested in a completely different subject area, that's another user type. Very quickly, you can spiral out of control and have, literally hundreds of different users that you're trying to give very, very granular levels of personalization to. And one thing we strongly recommend is not doing that, or having that as an end goal is wonderful, but starting at a very kind of simple level, having some very kind of broad, high level segmentation. So going as simple as saying undergraduate versus postgraduate, that's a really, really great place to start. And then actually having a really solid understanding of, hey, what are the things that undergraduates typically want to see compared to postgraduates? And by doing that, you can then, as we mentioned earlier, start implementing some really kind of nice, subtle elements of personalization. You can then test that stuff as well, see how effectively or otherwise it's actually helping users to kind of go down that funnel and go on that user journey. And then you can kind of constantly tweak and improve that, as opposed to, getting very, very overwhelmed very quickly, which it's very easy to do with personalization. I think that's often something that's underestimated, and probably what puts paid to probably like 80-90% of personalization projects that I see out there are people that just go too complicated too quickly, get overwhelmed by it, and end up kind of consuming all of their time doing these very, very complicated things. So keeping it simple, at least to begin with, would be my probably biggest piece of advice. And also, I think having a very, very strong understanding of your user types that you want to personalize to is another one. Don't skip that step. It's a really important step.
You've mentioned this in the past too, Julie, haven't you, around product developments? I know that testing is really important to you, and I think the going like full project from the beginning and not having that iterative approach is quite damaging sometimes, right?
So the first version should never be the final version. You really want to go out, test, make sure you're building what your end users need, and then iterate constantly. So get the data, keep iterating. And that's where AI can really help as well, because you can get enormous amount of data out of some of these launches around how people are using it, qualitative and quantitative, and really being able to find the insights into what you can do to improve that end user experience is really key.
So I want to pull this into more, uh, almost hook it in with a commercial example, but then look at it through the higher education lens. The other day I was looking, I think it was in the Guardian, and I came across an ad. It was a massive one, it was like double page, and it was from TikTok, and it was saying we value like team privacy, user privacy, all those sort of things that they're not known for. And whether the ad is like saying it's there for a reason, or we don't value these things, I'll leave it be up to you to judge. But it did make me think that because now we have a lot more legislation around the data we collect. We know that cookies are going away; they're already well on the way out. GDPR is quite strong, and there seems to be endless legislation coming out from the EU around AI and its use of like data in those algorithms and the content it produces. Um, in that context, what do you think, and how do you feel that institutions, higher ed institutions, can balance the needs of user privacy with standout personalized experiences? Because if you look at something like Amazon, it's basically a massive data hoover, and the reason it's so effective is because it's using literally everything it knows about its customers. How does higher eds, who tend to be a little bit more data ethical, data conscious, play in that market? Because it's quite a competitive one, and it's almost like the sector has one hand tied behind its back.
Yeah, as you mentioned, I'm actually quite pleased we're moving to that cookieless world. So tracking user behavior across every single site you go to, building up that persistent profile. It wasn't great for privacy, but it does mean that you need to make sure you're following all of the governance and regulations. There's a couple of different strategies you can really follow. So obviously the first one is that explicit user consent. So you always need to make sure that you're obtaining user consent for anything that you are gathering. So let your users know what data you're collecting and how that you're using it. And make sure that you provide really clear explanations and give users the options to opt in or opt out of that data collection. So that's really key. I think most of the legislation really covers that. One thing that legislation doesn't cover, but is actually really important, is that minimal data collection. So with data collection, less is more. There's this general trend I've seen across lots of different organizations, not just higher ed, where they collect everything, every single user interaction on the site, how long their brand was on every single page. And most of it just sits there in a data warehouse somewhere, completely useless. But, it's there just in case you might need it someday. But you probably won't. So you really need to focus, gather the data that's absolutely necessary for personalization. If you think you might need it one day, just don't get it. Smart, small, grow slowly, measure effectiveness, and then you can get more data later if that's what you really need. You want to really minimize and only capture and store the data that you really, really need. Gathering every single piece of information is just a recipe for possible disaster. Another thing that you can really do is anonymize that data. So an effective way to personalize without invading privacy is you can use anonymized or aggregated data. So these are those sort of segments instead of that individualized data. So you can identify general trends and preferences for things like, what do your undergraduates actually want without directly pinpointing individual users. So that's a lot safer as well. But it is really hard. So, as you said, it's not a level playing field. We've got Amazon, Zeme, all of the different sort of socials and e-commerce sites that collect everything about you and try and personalize it. But they don't always do a great job. I mean, Toby mentioned earlier the toilet story. So, just because and again, that's really goes down to they're collecting every single thing, but they're not making sensible decisions about what data they actually need to help their end users make better decisions. So, sure, they collected that you bought one thing once, but, is it, they're not categorizing it or using it really as effectively as they could be. So really it's all around what do you think you need for effective personalization? Just collect that with consent. And then also, make sure your security is top notch.
Your minimal point there is quite a valid one. The UK isn't too bad at this. I mean, a lot of forms during clearing, they ask for a lot of like a life history, basically. It's not uncommon, but if you think that's bad, you should look at the US. I mean, if you want to get information out of an institution, they don't have prospectuses over there. They call it information packs or whatever it is. Not lookbooks. I know the word is, but essentially, if you want one of these things, like you're looking at it's huge. You just wouldn't believe the amount of data that these institutions collect. And the web experience as a result isn't that much of an improvement. I mean, I've seen some personalized prospectuses in the US, and they're okay. They do put in like unique content that's relevant to a user, but the execution of the project just doesn't warrant the amount of data you need to sacrifice to get that result. Plus, on the back end of these systems, and I've worked in organizations that, like you said, have collected everything about users, like how long they stay on web pages, what they do on them, and they don't use it, but it also actually slows down their CRMs and their website. So, for the sake of collecting all this data they're not using, they are actually destroying live user experiences. And sometimes that connection isn't made between, the two. So yeah, ethically it's a bit of an issue, but also practically for your users, it's a bit of an issue too.
Yeah, no, definitely. That minimum collection of data. I mean, I've had to sort of fight that urge in myself. You're releasing a new product or something and you want to know everything about how anyone could be using it. It's like, well, what are you going to do with that information? Like, and so it's really about that effective personalization. There's a level of personalization you can do that really helps your end users get to their goal. It helps you meet the business objectives. It helps them meet their objectives. Everyone's happy. And then there's a whole lot of extra stuff you could do where you're putting a ton of effort into collecting data, cleaning data, trying to get all those insights out. But it's moving the needle this much, but you're spending this much time and effort on it. So it's really around what is that minimum effective personalization, the use cases, the user journey. Where do you get the most outcome for the time that you're spending and the time that your users are spending? And that's that magic. That's the magic there.
Toby, let's bring this home and look for more of a forward view here over the next 5 years. The landscape looks like it's going to get more and more legislated. I don't think we're going to lose legislation. If anything, I think I read an article a week about some new AI act or some new data protection policies coming into force. I think all of this is catching up with us somewhat. So if you were to take like a bit of an extended lens and to prioritize the action that HEI should be taken in this space, what do you think are those sort of go-to areas that, not that we should be concerned about, but what we should put in emphasis on when we're working on personalization efforts, and maybe with a view to the next 3 to 5 years rather than necessarily immediate responses and actions we get as a result of putting these into place?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one, isn't it? I think it's kind of tough to know exactly where particularly AI is going to take things, but I think it's both kind of frightening and exciting, and I like to kind of err on the side of exciting because I'm optimistic. But I think one of the biggest things we're going to see, which I'm particularly excited about, as I have a kind of a background in user research, and still spend a lot of my time sitting down with kind of our customers to understand about user needs and what people actually want. I think that AI is going to become very, very helpful with that type of thing. So typically user experience can be quite time consuming. It can be quite expensive. If we look at, say, running interviews, for example, it would be wonderful to sit down and interview thousands of students, historical students, graduates, everything in between. And if you did that and took the time to do that, you'd get some incredible data out of it and some really solid kind of understanding. But of course, that's not a practical thing to do because it would take months, years, decades, and it would be very, very expensive, and nobody wants to pay for that, understandably. But I think what AI will be able to do, it'll be able to do that stuff, or at least aid that stuff, in seconds, kind of click of the finger stuff. It'll be able to look at decades worth of data, particularly kind of quantitative stuff, looking at things like Google Analytics, data that you can kind of pull from your site to look at how people are interacting with it in an anonymized way. This doesn't have to kind of be looking at individuals' data. But actually, if you can do that over the span of decades worth of data, you can then start, I think, to see patterns emerging. And these are kind of patterns that human beings just can't really spot because they're not kind of attuned to be able to deal with that much data. When you've got that much data, you've obviously got a really kind of good sample size to look at. And that has some really good application, I think. And to maybe kind of give an example, and this might be a bit of a rubbish example, but at a very simple level, if AI can say, right, okay, over the course of 20 years worth of data, we can see that when a user comes to our site and looks at, let's say, these 5 pages in this particular order, they have a 30% increase in their likelihood to apply or enroll or to convert. That would be in like an absolutely golden nugget to understand, which that's going to be very, very difficult to kind of actually prove that if you're sat in, even if, say, 10 interviewees tell you that that's the case, 10 is not a very good sample size. That could just be, an anomaly or a bit of luck, or you happen
Yeah.
to pick 10 people. If you're looking at 10 years worth of data, then that becomes very profound and very compelling. And I think, what AI will be very good at is being able to kind of spot those trends and spot those patterns. And if we can then do something with that and kind of package that up in a way that AI can help us essentially generate the insights that then human beings can add them to implement really great personalization with that stuff. That to me, I think is that's at least where I hope things are going. I do totally accept that there are probably going to be some nefarious things going on, but also some very cool things as well going on.
Yeah.
And I think the legislation is going to have to be there and be strong to kind of stop that being super, super creepy. As Julie mentioned, we don't want creepy personalization. We want stuff to be useful. And I think also, just to dial it back, typically when we talk to students, and I think there's loads of stats out there that show that if you're actually very transparent with what you're doing with a user's data, and you're not doing nefarious things with it, and you're not storing data that you don't need to store, people generally are quite happy to part with their data if they understand what that value exchange is, and they understand that what they're getting for it is good, and they're getting better experiences as a result. And just being transparent about that is absolutely the way forward, I think. To kind of summarize, my hope is that AI is very much a kind of an enhancer to the process of personalization. But I do appreciate that there's going to be some incredible advances in it. And as is always the case, people tend to, use it in certain nefarious ways, and there will need to be legislation that kind of prevents that from happening.
You made a really good point there. So I read a report recently from HubSpot that identified that the number one way marketers are using AI is not to create content; it's actually for research. Um,
Mm.
and there's not a lot of content actually published around that. When you go on LinkedIn, all the kind of AI focused stuff is around content creation, production. There's no sort of niche right now, or creator, or organization exploring the research element of what prompts do you put in, how do you use these tools to get the maximum benefit out of the data that you've got. And you are right, like you can use ChatGPT or a whole range of like AI tools to share anonymized data and get that insight very very quickly that would take a human a long time to understand. You can even layer it with the qualitative stuff as well. So if you wanted to add in like years worth of like interviews and stuff you've done with students to get sentiment, you can put that over the top of it to get that extra layer of insight. So like I mean, yes, there are ethical implications and there are some bad actors, and there's a lot of those stories coming through. There's some particularly entertaining and concerning ones around at the moment. But I think overall that the ability and the extension this technology gives us is wonderful. And there's only room for growth. We know ChatGPT is now actually crawling websites. It's got a new bot similar to Google bot going on now. So it actually has the potential to have the macro context put into your data as well. So I think the research angle is a really strong one. You're not using technology itself to have personalized conversations, but actually using it to inform personalization as an action, right?
Absolutely, yeah. And I don't doubt that we'll probably get to that at one point where you'll be able to type into Chat GBT, hey, like, give me some great examples to personalize my website using all this data. And in 30 seconds, it'll kick out a load of really interesting stuff. I do, like, weirdly, maybe a bit of a purist. Like, I kind of feel personally that slightly takes away the fun of the kind of creativity of doing personalization. Like, I love the idea of getting a load of help with making sense of data and spotting patterns and then being able to use that to do cool stuff. That's where I think the real fun is. And I do hope that we don't get to a situation where everything is a little bit kind of sanitized and we're getting Chat GBT and other various other AI things to kind of do the creative work for us. I hope we don't get to that point. But it's going to be super, super interesting to see. The legislative stuff in general is an interesting one. When we look at, for example, the kind of EU sort of privacy directive when it came to third-party cookies, even though actually it's a really good directive, I don't actually think it's policed particularly well. You still, on a daily basis, I encounter sites where if you reject a bunch of cookies on a site, the site actually becomes unworkable, or actually they won't even let you access a site unless you click on, accept all cookies, which actually is illegal based on the legislation. But at the moment, I don't think it's policed particularly well, which doesn't bode sort of brilliantly, I suppose, for other legislation coming in. It's like, if we can't get that right, are we going to get this other stuff right? And so I do think maybe there's going to need to be an element of slightly better policing of it as well. But I don't think I'll be holding my breath, I guess, certainly in the initial kind of days of it, where I think we'll have kind of stuff that comes out which maybe isn't particularly well kind of well policed. That's not to say we should be looking at ways to kind of contravene it. We absolutely shouldn't. But yeah, I think my overall point would be I'm super excited about the prospects of AI doing wonderful things for us in terms of research and being able to generate those insights for us. That actually that's what leads to the brilliant personalization. We talked about it a little bit earlier. People often like to skip that step. Perhaps having AI in there to help kind of not necessarily do it for us per se, but to make it a hell of a lot easier. That makes the whole thing a little bit more palatable and less easy to ignore, I suppose.
It's interesting your point about the policing of it. When you practically lay it out like that, it is almost impossible for one entity to police the internet. But it is impossible. So they tend to go after the big organizations, don't they? Making examples of them, it gets media coverage, and that's how the not the myth of legislation exists, but the threat of legislation actually holds a bit of weight. Thank you both very much for joining me this morning. It's been really good actually to look at personalization from slightly different lenses and expand our understanding of it, and it's especially around the research area and using AI to inform that conversation and that discussion. Where can people get in touch with you? What's the best way to reach out?
For me, my email address is I've got a bit of a pain in the bum surname. It's so my email address is tmargetts@squiz.co.uk. Margetts is Margetts. Best place to get me is there, tmargetts@squiz.co.uk.
Great. And you, Julie?
Oh, I'll go simpler. So if you just do ask@squiz.net, and if you can't figure out how to spell Toby's name, I'll forward it to you.
I've stitched myself up there massively.
It's all good. Just ask@squiz.net. That'll hit me and we can get back to you.